Welcome to Nidra Narratives. Settle in, like and subscribe this channel, and leave in comments what content would you like to see. Chapter 1. The Gathering Storm over Pataliputra. Tonight, we travel to ancient India, to a world where an empire larger than Western Europe awaited its next ruler. In the year 273 BCE, while Rome and Carthage clashed over distant Sicily and the great states of China warred for supremacy, a dying emperor in India faced a profound question. Which of his sons would inherit the mightiest realm the subcontinent had ever known? The answer would unfold over 4 years of political maneuvering, whispered conspiracies, and the clash of ambitions, transforming the empire and the man who would emerge to lead it. How does a younger prince, rejected by his father and overlooked by tradition, seize a throne meant for another? What drives ministers to betray their dying emperor's wishes and gamble everything on a prophecy? And what kind of man emerges from years of struggle for succession? A man who would later renounce violence and attempt to govern an empire through compassion alone. Let us travel back together to the fertile plains of the Ganges, where the monsoon clouds gather heavy with rain, and where in a palace of carved wood and painted walls, an empire awaits its next master. The city of Pataliputra stretched for some 15 kilometers along the confluence of the Ganges and Son rivers, a parallelogram of wooden walls and 64 gates that enclosed one of the largest cities in the ancient world. For listeners unfamiliar with Indian geography, imagine the Ganges as India's Nile, a sacred river flowing from the Himalayan mountains through the most fertile agricultural land on earth, sustaining a civilization as ancient and sophisticated as any in the Mediterranean world. At this confluence of waters, where trade routes converged and rice paddies stretched to the horizon, the Mauryan emperors had built their capital, and here, in the humid air of the monsoon season, the second emperor of the dynasty lay dying. Bindusara, known to the Greeks as Ep03, had ruled for approximately 25 years, maintaining the enormous empire his father Chandragupta had forged through conquest and diplomacy. The wooden palisades of the palace, which Greek visitors declared surpassed even the magnificent structures of Persia, enclosed a world of intrigue and ambition. Oil lamps cast long shadows in the emperor's chamber, their flames flickering in the humid air. The scent of sandalwood incense mingled with medicinal herbs as physicians attended the failing monarch, while in the corridors beyond, courtiers gathered in anxious clusters, speaking in whispers that would determine the fate of nations. The Mauryan succession was never a simple matter. According to the chronicles preserved in the Buddhist monasteries of Sri Lanka, Bindusara had 16 queens who bore him many sons. The texts claim 101, a number that historians recognize as symbolic rather than literal, representing the vast royal household and the many potential claimants to the throne. Among these princes, 2 figures dominated the political landscape, and their contrast could not have been more stark. Susima, the eldest son, had been groomed from childhood for the throne. Born to a queen of royal blood, he had been appointed viceroy of Taxila, the great northwestern city that served as the empire's gateway to Central Asia and the Hellenistic kingdoms beyond. Taxila was a cosmopolitan metropolis where Indian, Persian, and Greek cultures mingled, where merchants traded goods from across the known world, and where students could receive instruction in everything from medicine to mathematics at its famous center of learning. Yet Susima's tenure there had been troubled. A popular revolt had erupted during his governorship, blamed upon the oppression of local officials, and Susima had failed to quell the unrest effectively. The dust of caravans still arrived at Taxila's gates, the babel of languages still filled its markets, but the city had revealed something about its governor. He was not the man his father had hoped. Ashoka, by contrast, was a younger prince whose mother, Subhadrangi, was said to be the daughter of a Brahmin, a member of the priestly scholarly class who served as guardians of Hindu scripture and ritual, from the city of Champa. Her relatively humble origins, compared to the royal mothers of other princes, marked Ashoka from birth as an outsider in the complex hierarchy of the royal household. The chronicles preserve a telling detail. When Ashoka was young, his father disliked him for his rough and unappealing skin. This rejection may have bred in him a fierce determination to prove himself, a willingness to use any means necessary to achieve his goals. Yet where Susuma had failed, Ashoka had succeeded. Sent to govern Ujjain, the prosperous city in central India that controlled the trade routes between the Deccan Plateau and the northern plains, the young prince had proven himself capable. Ujjain was an ancient city on the eastern bank of the Shipra River, protected by impressive fortifications, a mud rampart some 12 meters high and a moat 45 meters wide. Within these walls, merchants traded in textiles and metalwork, temples drew pilgrims from across the region, and the scent of champaka flowers and neem leaves drifted through gardens where peacocks called at dawn. Here, Ashoka had learned to manage the complex bureaucracy of Mauryan administration, to adjudicate disputes, to collect taxes, and to maintain order in a diverse population. Here too, he had married Devi, the daughter of a merchant from nearby Vidisha, a marriage to a commoner that may have reflected his relatively low status among Bindusara's sons, or may have reflected his own preferences, or may simply have connected him to the merchant class, whose support would prove crucial in the coming struggle. The palace where these princes had grown to manhood was itself a testament to imperial grandeur and meticulous organization. Drawing inspiration from the magnificent structures of Persepolis, the capital of the ancient Persian Empire, it was constructed primarily of wood, chosen not merely for its abundance in the forested Gangetic plain, but for practical reasons, as wooden structures could better withstand the seasonal floods that swept through the region. Yet this was no crude construction. The palace stood within an extensive park, its grounds dotted with ornamental tanks where enormous tame fish swam in waters that only the young princes were permitted to fish. Peacocks and pheasants wandered through the gardens, their calls echoing across the manicured grounds. In the early morning hours, before the heat of the day descended, the gardens would have been alive with birdsong, the splash of fountains, the distant trumpeting of elephants from the royal stables. The interior was organized according to the prescriptions laid down in the Arthashastra, the treatise on statecraft attributed to Kautilya, Chandragupta's legendary chief minister. This text, which can be translated as the science of wealth or the science of politics, was a comprehensive manual on how to build and maintain a powerful state, covering everything from taxation and espionage to military strategy and the management of the royal household. In its cold-blooded pragmatism and its focus on power rather than morality, it has often been compared to Machiavelli's The Prince, though it predates that work by more than 17 centuries. The palace was protected by an outer wall and a moat, creating a fortress within the larger fortified city. In its rear were the women's apartments, the Antapura, a term meaning inner dwelling, with stores of medicines used in midwifery. Outside these apartments were the residences of the princes and princesses, those very chambers where Ashoka and his brothers had grown to manhood, where rivalries had festered and alliances had formed. In front of these came the toilet chambers, then the council house, the hall of audience, and finally the administrative offices. The arrangement was not merely architectural but political. The deeper one penetrated into the palace, the closer one came to the center of power, and the more carefully one's movements were observed. A special household guard comprising 50 men and women looked after the security of the royal quarters. Everything that went inside and came out was carefully inspected to prevent any threats to the king's life. The women of the royal household, along with their slaves and attendants, were prohibited from contact with wandering ascetics and outsiders. Not merely prudery, but security, for the Arthashastra warned kings of various dangers, citing historical examples of rulers who had faced threats from unexpected quarters. The king's own suite of rooms was the innermost sanctum, accessible only to those who had passed through multiple layers of security. On rising from bed, the king was received by his Amazonian bodyguard, women archers who formed his first line of defense. These trained warriors, equipped with bows and arrows, were both practical and symbolic. The Greek ambassador Megasthenes, who had lived in Pataliputra during Chandragupta's reign, corroborated that women in the Mauryan court carried weapons and accompanied the king on hunts, riding in chariots, on horseback, and on elephants. The daily routine of a Mauryan king was a grueling schedule that left little time for leisure. The royal day was divided into 8 parts, each dedicated to specific duties, receiving reports from various departments and spies, managing revenue and expenditure, attending to administrative and judicial matters, reviewing defense preparations, performing religious duties, personal activities, meeting with ambassadors, and strategic planning. The night was similarly divided, with only 6 hours allotted to sleep. This was the world that Bindusara inhabited as his health failed, a world of rigid schedules, constant vigilance, and elaborate ritual. It was also the world that his sons sought to inherit, understanding that to become emperor meant not merely to wear a crown, but to assume a burden of governance that would consume every waking hour. Beyond the palace walls, the city of Pataliputra hummed with the rhythms of daily commerce and craft. The wooden fortifications that encircled the city were pierced by those 64 gates, each one a portal through which flowed the lifeblood of the empire. Grain from the surrounding countryside, textiles from the weaving centers of the east, metalwork from the mines of the south, horses from the northwestern frontiers. The streets were laid out in a grid pattern, a testament to the urban planning that characterized Mauryan administration. Guilds of craftsmen, potters, weavers, metalworkers, carpenters occupied designated quarters, their workshops filling the air with the sounds of hammers on anvils, the clatter of looms, the calls of merchants hawking their wares. The river itself was the city's greatest asset, a highway of commerce that connected Pataliputra to the Bay of Bengal in the east, and, through a network of tributaries, to the heartland of northern India. Boats of all sizes crowded the ghats, the stepped embankments that lined the riverfront, unloading cargoes of rice and fish, loading bales of cotton and bundles of indigo. The smell of the river mingled with the smoke of cooking fires, the fragrance of flowers offered at small shrines, the pungent aroma of spices being ground in market stalls. This was the city that would serve as the prize in the coming struggle, the seat of an empire that stretched from the Hindu Kush mountains in the northwest to the Bay of Bengal in the east, from the Himalayan foothills in the north to the Deccan Plateau in the south. As the monsoon clouds gathered over Pataliputra in 273 BCE, the political situation grew increasingly volatile. Bindusara wanted Susima to succeed him, but Ashoka was supported by his father's ministers, who found Susima arrogant and disrespectful. The chronicles preserve a telling anecdote. Susima once slapped a bald minister on his head in jest. The minister worried that after ascending the throne, Susima might treat him with similar disregard. This seemingly trivial incident, whether historical or apocryphal, captures the essential dynamic. Susima had made enemies of the very officials who would determine the succession. The role of prophecy in Ashoka's rise cannot be overlooked, for it served both to legitimize his eventual victory and to explain why ministers would risk supporting a younger prince against the designated heir. An Ajivika astrologer, a member of an ascetic tradition that rivaled Buddhism and Jainism in ancient India, at Bindusara's court, prophesied the future greatness of Prince Ashoka. When asked by Bindusara to assess which prince should succeed him, this man recognized Ashoka's destiny, but refused to name him directly to avoid the emperor's anger. Instead, he spoke in riddles, saying that one who had the best mount, seat, drink, vessel, and food would be the next king. And each time, Ashoka declared that he met the criterion. The dying emperor, perhaps sensing the coming storm, attempted to arrange the succession according to his wishes. He asked his ministers to appoint Susima as the emperor and Ashoka as the governor of Taxila, effectively removing the younger prince from the capital and placing him in a distant frontier province. However, by this time, Susima had been sent to Taxila, where he was unsuccessfully trying to quell yet another rebellion. When the emperor was on his deathbed, the ministers suggested appointing Ashoka as the temporary emperor and reappointing Susima after his return. Bindusara became angry when he heard this suggestion, recognizing it for what it was, a maneuver to place his unfavored son on the throne. What happened next is described in terms that blend the miraculous with the political. Ashoka declared that if he was meant to be Bindusara's successor, the divine beings would appoint him as the emperor. According to the legend, the gods then miraculously placed the imperial crown on his head while Bindusara died. This supernatural narrative likely masks a more prosaic reality, that Ashoka, with the support of key ministers, seized control of the capital while his elder brother was absent and his father lay dying or newly dead. The death of Bindusara thus marked not the end of a reign, but the beginning of a 4-year interregnum of political struggle, a contest for succession that would claim the ambitions of princes and reshape the political landscape of the empire. In the coming years, brothers would depart from the palace, never to return, and alliances would shift like the waters of the Ganges in flood. From this crucible would emerge the man who would become one of history's most remarkable rulers. But that transformation lay in the future, beyond years of conflict, and a war that would change everything he believed about power, conquest, and the meaning of victory. Chapter 2. The Conspiracy of Ministers. Behind every successful usurpation lies a network of conspirators, and Ashoka's rise to power was no exception. The Buddhist sources preserve the names and actions of the ministers who engineered his succession, revealing a sophisticated political operation that combined prophecy, propaganda, and calculated violence. At the center of this conspiracy stood two figures whose actions would determine the fate of an empire: Radhagupta and Kalataka, ministers whose fear of Susima's arrogance drove them to gamble everything on a younger prince. The chronicles tell us that Bindusara had 500 imperial councillors, a number that, like the 100 Brothers, is probably symbolic rather than literal, representing the vast ministerial class that administered the Mauryan state. These officials were not mere servants of the throne. They were stakeholders in the empire's success, with their own interests, ambitions, and fears. The Mauryan administrative system was highly sophisticated, with specialized departments for military affairs, treasury, espionage, and provincial administration. According to Megasthenes, the imperial army alone was run by a committee of 30 superintendents, while each branch or department was run by a committee of 5 men. A king who alienated these officials risked losing not just their support, but his life. Kalataka, one of the royal ministers, had a rivalry with Susima. Hence, he was fearful that if Susima was appointed as king, he would be punished. Therefore, he approached the royal councillors and convinced them to support Ashoka as the emperor after Bindusara's death. The motivations were not purely idealistic, they were born of self-preservation. The ministers cultivated the prophecy that Ashoka was destined to become a Chakravartin, a universal ruler. This prophecy, whether genuinely believed or cynically manufactured, provided legitimacy for what would otherwise be naked usurpation. The concept of the Chakravartin requires explanation for those unfamiliar with Indian religious and political thought. The term literally means wheel-turning emperor, referring to the wheel as a symbol of royal power and cosmic order. In both Buddhism and Hinduism, a Chakravartin is supposed to uphold dharma, a term that encompasses law, duty, righteousness, and cosmic order. Indeed, being he who turns the wheel of dharma. There are 3 types of Chakravartin in Indian tradition. One who rules over all 4 continents of Buddhist cosmology, one who governs only one continent, and one who leads only part of a continent. The prophecy that Ashoka would become a Chakravartin was thus a claim that he possessed a kind of cosmic legitimacy that transcended the normal rules of succession. Rudagupta was instrumental in guiding Ashoka during the intense succession struggle. The chronicles provide a detailed account of how he first demonstrated his support. When Minister Rudagupta saw Ashoka leaving the capital for the Garden of the Golden Pavilion, where Bindusara would determine his successor, he offered to provide the prince with an imperial elephant for the travel. This seemingly minor gesture was laden with political significance. By providing Ashoka with a royal elephant, Rudagupta was signaling his support and enhancing the prince's prestige before the crucial test. At the garden, the ascetic who had prophesied Ashoka's greatness examined the princes and realized that Ashoka would be the next emperor. To avoid annoying Bindusara, the ascetic refused to name the successor directly. Instead, he said that one who had the best mount, seat, drink, vessel, and food would be the next king. Each time, Ashoka declared that he met the criterion, a declaration made possible, in part, by Rudagupta's gift of the elephant. The conspiracy operated on multiple levels: ideological preparation through prophecy, practical preparation through positioning, and finally, the elimination of opposition. When Bindusara fell sick, Ashoka returned to Pataliputra from Ujjain and gained control of the capital. This was not a spontaneous decision, but the execution of a carefully laid plan. The ministers had to coordinate Ashoka's return, ensure his access to the palace, and neutralize any forces loyal to Susima or other rivals. Even though Bindusara, on his deathbed, declared Susima to be the emperor, Ashoka, with the support of the royal councillors and nobles, took over the throne. The ministers' support was not merely advisory. They actively participated in the seizure of power, overriding the dying emperor's explicit wishes. The 4 years between Bindusara's death and Ashoka's formal coronation represent one of the most violent and consequential periods in Mauryan history. The chronicles describe a fratricidal war in which Ashoka won at last. One text states that he killed 100 of his brothers and was crowned 4 years later. Another claims 99 half-brothers, sparing only his uterine brother Tissa. Historians have long recognized these figures as symbolic exaggerations. The Tibetan writer Taranatha, writing many centuries later, states that Ashoka killed 6 brothers to capture the throne, a number that seems far more plausible given the political realities of the succession. The exaggerated numbers serve the Buddhist narrative of transformation rather than historical accuracy. Such descriptions of Ashoka's cruelty were perhaps motivated exaggerations on the part of the Buddhist writers who wanted to show Ashoka as Chandashoka, Ashoka the Fierce, before he became a Buddhist and turned into Dharmashoka, Ashoka the Righteous. The greater the contrast between his violent past and his peaceful future, the more powerful the message of Buddhist transformation. Yet we should not dismiss the violence entirely as literary invention. A succession war lasting 4 years suggests sustained military operations across multiple fronts, the need to secure provincial capitals, and the gradual elimination of rival claimants and their supporters. The Mauryan Empire was divided into 4 provinces, with provincial capitals at Tasali in the east, Ujjain in the west, Suvarnagiri in the south, and Taxila in the north. The head of the provincial administration was typically a royal prince, who governed as the emperor's representative. The civil war may thus have involved military operations across this vast territory, as Ashoka's forces moved to secure each provincial capital and eliminate rival claimants. When Susima heard that Ashoka had seized the throne, he advanced toward Pataliputra to claim his birthright. However, he was killed through the actions of Radhagupta, who had been appointed to support Ashoka's claim. Susima's death removed the primary obstacle to Ashoka's rule. His general, Bhadrayudha, witnessing these events, withdrew from political life and became a Buddhist monk. Radhagupta would later be appointed prime minister by Ashoka once he had gained the throne, a reward commensurate with his services during the succession struggle. The pattern of violence was selective rather than indiscriminate. It is quite likely that other brothers who fought on the side of Prince Susima might have been killed by Ashoka, and those who supported him might have saved their lives by making peace with him. This suggests targeted elimination of active opponents, combined with amnesty for those who submitted. Indeed, Ashoka's own inscriptions, erected long after his coronation, refer to his brothers and sisters and other relatives for whose welfare he was most anxious. Inscriptional evidence also indirectly suggests that some of his brothers served as his viceroys in prominent places. According to the chronicles, Ashoka even appointed his youngest brother Tishya as the deputy king. The ministerial conspiracy that brought Ashoka to power reveals much about the nature of Mauryan politics. The empire, for all its centralization, depended on the cooperation of a powerful bureaucratic class. A king who cultivated them, as Ashoka did, whether by temperament or calculation, could count on their active assistance in seizing and maintaining power. Radhagupta's role is often considered pivotal in shaping Ashoka's early years as a ruler, which later culminated in his transformation into a peaceful and benevolent monarch. The chronicles preserve one final detail about Radhagupta that hints at a deeper connection between the minister and the prince he helped to power. The text states that Ashoka's companion Vijaya in a previous life was reborn as Ashoka's prime minister, Radhagupta. This karmic connection, whether believed literally or understood metaphorically, suggests that the relationship between Ashoka and Radhagupta was seen as more than political convenience. It was destiny, written in the stars and the cycles of rebirth. While this drama unfolded in Pataliputra, the wider world continued its own struggles for power and supremacy. The First Punic War between Rome and Carthage was entering its 9th year, a brutal conflict for control of the Western Mediterranean that would last 23 years and claim countless lives. The Seleucid Empire, which shared a border with the Mauryan realm in what is now Afghanistan, was experiencing its own period of consolidation under Antiochus I Soter, who faced challenges in the West, including repeated wars with Ptolemaic Egypt and a Celtic invasion of Asia Minor. In China, the Warring States period continued, with the state of Qin gradually consolidating power in a process that would culminate in the unification of China under the first emperor in 221 BCE. The parallels between these succession struggles are instructive. Throughout its existence, the Seleucid Empire was plagued by wars over the succession and local uprisings accompanying the inauguration of virtually each new king. The founder of the dynasty, Seleucus I Nicator, had himself been assassinated in 281 BCE, just 8 years before Bindusara's death, by a disgruntled prince who then claimed territory as his own. This pattern, the death of a powerful ruler creating opportunities for ambitious rivals, repeated itself across the ancient world. Yet there was a crucial difference. The First Punic War was a conflict between two separate states, each with its own territory and resources. The Mauryan Succession War was a civil conflict, a family tearing itself apart, with brothers who had grown up in the same palace, now commanding armies against one another. This made it, in some ways, even more bitter than the struggle between Rome and Carthage. When Susima advanced from Taxila toward Pataliputra to claim his birthright, he was not marching against a foreign enemy, but against his own brother, through lands that had been part of the same empire for 2 generations. The Seleucid Empire and the Mauryan Empire were not merely parallel cases, but actual neighbours. The western border of the Mauryan realm abutted the eastern frontier of the Seleucid state. Ashoka's grandfather, Chandragupta Maurya, had signed a treaty with Seleucus I Nicator, exchanging territory for war elephants and establishing diplomatic relations that continued through the reigns of their successors. When Bindusara died and civil war erupted among his sons, the Seleucid court would have watched with keen interest, wondering whether the change of rulers in India would affect the delicate balance of power along their shared frontier. The diplomatic ties between these 2 great empires extended beyond mere treaties. Greek ambassadors had resided at the Mauryan court since Chandragupta's time, sending back detailed reports of Indian customs, administration, and court life. Megasthenes, the Seleucid ambassador to Chandragupta's court, had written extensively about the wonders of Pataliputra, its wooden walls stretching for miles along the Ganges, its elaborate system of moats and towers, its bustling markets where merchants from across Asia traded in spices, textiles, and precious stones. His successor, Dimachus, had served at Bindusara's court, and diplomatic exchanges continued even as the succession crisis unfolded. The 4-year interregnum thus emerges as a period of consolidation as much as conquest. Ashoka had to secure the capital, eliminate his principal rival, Susima, neutralize or co-opt other brothers, win over or replace provincial governors, and establish his authority over an empire stretching from Afghanistan to Bengal, from the Himalayas to the Deccan. Only when this process was complete, when all serious challenges to his rule had been eliminated, could he proceed with the formal coronation that would mark the beginning of his reign as the undisputed emperor of the Mauryan realm. Chapter 3. The Armies of Brothers. The 4-year civil war that followed Bindusara's death was not merely a political struggle, but a military campaign that mobilized the vast resources of the Mauryan army. To understand what this conflict meant for those who lived through it, we must look beyond the princes and ministers to the soldiers who fought, the camps where they lived, and the material culture of warfare that shaped their daily experience. The Mauryan army was the largest standing military force of its time, and its deployment in a civil war would have affected hundreds of thousands of lives across the empire. Classical sources state that the army of Chandragupta Maurya comprised 600,000 infantry, 30,000 cavalry, and 9,000 war elephants, numbers that, even if exaggerated, suggest a military establishment of unprecedented scale. This was not a militia or citizen army, but a regular standing force, in receipt of due remuneration paid by the state, supplied with necessary equipment, and always remaining at the state's disposal and command. The trumpeting of war elephants echoing across the battlefield, the smell of cooking fires and horse dung in the military camp, the weight of the bamboo longbow braced against the ground. These were the sensory realities of Mauryan warfare. The basic tactical unit of the Mauryan army was the Pati, a mixed platoon that combined different arms in a single formation. This unit comprised one elephant carrying 3 archers or spearmen and a mahout, the elephant driver, 3 horse cavalrymen armed with javelins, round buckler and spear, and 5 infantry soldiers armed with shield and broadsword or bow. The 12-man unit assembled in groups of 3 to form a company, and 3 companies formed a battalion. Units were added in multiples of 3, eventually forming an army comprising over 250,000 men. This combined arms approach was remarkably sophisticated for its time. Instead of having separate units of spearmen, archers, and cavalry, the Mauryan army trained these different arms to work together, employing their weapons in concert. The result was an army that could adapt to different terrains and opponents, deploying its various arms as the situation required. When Ashoka and Susima commanded their respective forces, they were not leading ragged bands of warriors, but disciplined military formations that represented the accumulated military wisdom of generations. The weapons of the Mauryan soldier reflected both indigenous traditions and foreign influences. Infantry were most commonly armed with a longbow made of bamboo, a weapon so large that it had to be braced against the ground and drawn with the left foot to achieve a full draw. Greek sources claim that these Indian bows were powerful enough to pierce even heavy Greek armor, though the time required to fire them limited their rate of shooting. Other foot soldiers carried large animal hide tower shields and spears or javelins. All soldiers, regardless of their primary weapon, carried a sword, the khanda or broadsword, that would remain the characteristic weapon of Indian warriors for centuries. Cavalry were equipped with 2 lances and a shorter buckler than that carried by foot soldiers. The horses of Cambodia and Sindhu, regions in the northwest of the empire, were regarded as the best, bred in the northwestern regions where the terrain favored horse rearing. War elephants, the most distinctive arm of the Indian military, carried 3 warriors with bows and 1 mahout. A special long lance called the tamara was carried by infantry mounted on elephants, used to counter any enemy soldiers who fought their way through the elephant's infantry screen to attack the animal itself. Protective equipment in the Mauryan army was relatively light by the standards of the contemporary Mediterranean world. Helmets were not in wide use. Instead, the thick folds of the turban provided what protection the soldier's head received. Shields were typically made of oxhide, spread over wooden and wicker frames. Body armor was not common, though after Alexander's invasion, the use of metal and lamellar armor became more widespread, particularly for horses and elephants. The Mauryan soldier relied more on mobility and the coordinated action of different arms than on heavy defensive equipment. The army was administered by a sophisticated bureaucratic system. The imperial army was run by a committee of 30 superintendents, while each branch or department, infantry, cavalry, elephants, chariots, navy, commissariat, was run by a committee of 5 men. These civilian superintendents oversaw the operations of state armories, where all military equipment and weapons were manufactured, as well as supply depots, training, and general combat readiness. The Senapati, or commander-in-chief, an official of ministerial dignity, coordinated the entire war office. The Arthashastra describes the support services that accompanied the army on campaign. Scouts examined camps, roads, and rivers, dug wells, prepared landing places on rivers, and transported machines, weapons, armor, instruments, and provisions. They also carried away from the battlefield men who were knocked down, along with their weapons and armor. Medical and ambulance arrangements were equally important. Surgeons carrying surgical instruments, apparatus, medicines, healing oils and bandages, along with nurses with prepared food and beverages, were always in attendance to encourage the soldiers to fight. This was, in effect, an ancient version of organized battlefield medicine, essential for maintaining the army's fighting capacity. When the civil war broke out following Bindusara's death, these military resources were divided between the contending factions. The ministers who supported Ashoka controlled the capital and, presumably, the central military establishment. Susima, advancing from Taxila, would have commanded the forces of the northwestern province. Other brothers may have controlled other provincial armies, depending on their positions and alliances. The 4-year duration of the conflict suggests sustained military operations across multiple fronts, as Ashoka's forces moved to secure each provincial capital and eliminate rival claimants. The experience of soldiers in this civil war would have been shaped by the rhythms of camp life. The Arthashastra provides detailed instructions for the layout of military camps, the posting of guards, the management of supplies, and the maintenance of discipline. Soldiers would have slept in tents or under the open sky, depending on the season and the availability of shelter. They would have eaten the same staple foods as the civilian population: rice or wheat, lentils, vegetables, and whatever meat or fish could be obtained, prepared by camp followers who accompanied the army. The sounds of the military camp would have included the trumpeting of elephants, the neighing of horses, the clatter of weapons being cleaned and sharpened, the murmur of soldiers talking around cooking fires, and the drums and trumpets that mark the divisions of the day and signalled commands in battle. For the families left behind when the army marched, the civil war brought anxiety and hardship. The Arthashastra describes the payment of soldiers' wages and the support provided to their dependents, but civil war disrupted these systems. Women whose husbands fought for the losing side faced the prospect of widowhood and destitution. Children grew up without fathers. Villages that lay in the path of marching armies saw their crops requisitioned, their livestock seized, their young men conscripted. The succession struggle that seems so abstract in the palace chronicles was, for ordinary people, a catastrophe that disrupted every aspect of daily life. It was from this crucible of conflict that the legend of Ashoka, Ashoka the Fierce, emerged. According to Buddhist chronicles, particularly the Ashoka Ashoka in his early years was known as a harsh and uncompromising ruler. The texts describe him maintaining strict control over his realm through fear rather than affection. These accounts, composed centuries after his death by Buddhist monks seeking to dramatize the transformative power of their faith, paint a portrait of a man who inspired dread before he inspired devotion. The chronicles tell of an encounter that changed everything. A meeting between the young emperor and a Buddhist monk named Samudra. According to legend, Samudra's composure in the face of adversity, his demonstration of inner peace amid outer turmoil, planted a seed of doubt in Ashoka's mind. The monk embodied something the emperor had never encountered, a man who could not be moved by threats, whose equanimity remained unshaken. This encounter, whether historical or symbolic, marks the beginning of Ashoka's transformation in Buddhist memory. How much of this legend reflects historical reality? Scholars have long debated this question. The Buddhist legends tend to dramatize the change that Buddhism brought in him, and therefore exaggerate Ashoka's past wickedness and his piousness after the conversion. The specific stories may be literary devices crafted to illustrate the transformative power of Buddhist teaching, rather than to record historical events. Yet there are reasons to take the portrait of Ashoka seriously, even if we discount the specific details. The Buddhist monk Xuanzang, traveling through India in the 7th century CE, recorded local traditions about Ashoka's early reign that echoed the chronicle accounts. In the 5th century, another Buddhist pilgrim, Faxian, reported similar stories. These independent witnesses suggest that the memory of Ashoka's harsh early rule persisted in local tradition for nearly a millennium after his death. What we can say with greater confidence is that Ashoka's path to power was violent, and that his early reign was characterized by aggressive expansion. After he became emperor, Ashoka launched military campaigns to expand his empire, which lasted for around 8 years. The psychological profile that emerges from these sources is of a man shaped by conflict from his earliest years, disliked by his father, competing with numerous brothers, forced to fight for survival and then for power. The transition from Ashoka to Dharmashoka, from Ashoka the Fierce to Ashoka the Righteous, would become one of the great transformation narratives of the ancient world. But that transformation lay in the future. For now, in the years immediately following his coronation, Ashoka was a warrior king in the mold of his grandfather Chandragupta, consolidating his power through military force and preparing for the campaigns that would extend Mauryan rule to its greatest extent. The army that had fought the civil war now turned its attention outward. The same soldiers who had marched against Susima's forces would soon march against the kingdoms that remained outside Mauryan control. The same elephants that had trampled through the succession struggle would carry Ashoka's banners into new territories. And the same administrative machinery that had sustained 4 years of civil conflict would now sustain 8 years of imperial expansion. In the military camps that dotted the empire, soldiers settled into the routines of peacetime service, training, garrison duty, the maintenance of equipment and animals. But they knew, as soldiers always know, that peace was temporary. The young emperor had proven himself in the crucible of civil war. Now he would prove himself on a larger stage, against enemies beyond the empire's borders. The campaigns that lay ahead would test the Mauryan military machine as never before, and would ultimately lead Ashoka to the moment of crisis that would transform him and his empire forever. Chapter 4. The Texture of Empire. Beyond the clash of armies and the whispers of conspirators, the world of the Mauryan succession crisis was one of extraordinary material sophistication. A civilization whose textiles, cuisine, and daily rhythms reflected centuries of accumulated wealth and refinement. To understand the stakes of the succession struggle, we must understand the empire that the princes fought to control, not as an abstract political entity, but as a living world of sensory richness and human experience. When Prince Ashoka rode to the garden of the Golden Pavilion, on the royal elephant provided by Minister Radhagupta, he would have been dressed in garments that proclaimed his status as a prince of the blood. The clothing of the Mauryan elite was not merely covering for the body, but a language of power, a visual vocabulary that communicated rank, wealth, and aspiration to all who beheld it. The basic garments of the Mauryan period were unstitched, draped rather than tailored, continuing a tradition that stretched back to the Vedic age. The primary lower garment was the antarya, a length of fine white cotton, linen, or muslin that was wrapped around the hips and legs in a style that created a loose, trouser-like effect. For royalty and the upper classes, this antarya would have been of the finest quality, the cotton so delicately woven that contemporary poets compared it to a cloud of steam or a snake's slough, so thin that the eye could not trace the thread's path. The weaving centres of the Gangetic Plain had achieved a level of sophistication that would not be surpassed for millennia. Over the antarya, men of rank wore the uttarya, a long scarf or shawl that could be draped in various ways according to personal preference, occasion, and social standing. The upper classes and courtiers draped their uttarya of fine cotton, muslin or silk on one or both shoulders, or diagonally across the torso. The manner of wearing this garment was itself a form of communication. A prince appearing before his dying father would drape it differently than when riding to war or attending a religious ceremony. The textiles of the Mauryan period reflected both indigenous traditions and the empire's connections to the wider world. Cotton remained the primary fibre, cultivated in India since the Harappan era and processed with techniques that had been refined over 2 millennia. Silk was available, though whether it was imported from China or produced from indigenous silkworm species remains debated by scholars. The grammarian Panini, who lived in the century before the Mauryas, mentioned lac, madder, and indigo as dyes used to colour textiles. Red, white, yellow, and blue were recognized as the 4 primary colours for textile dyeing, with indigo leaves providing the deep blue that would later become famous throughout the ancient world. But it was in jewellery that the Mauryan elite truly displayed their wealth and status. Looking at the sculptures from this period, we can see that both men and women were fond of wearing elaborate ornaments of gold and precious stones, coral, rubies, sapphires, agates, and crystals. The kundala, or earring, came in 3 types: the simple ring, the circular disc earring, and the flower-shaped variety. 2 kinds of necklaces were worn, a short, broad, flat piece, usually made of gold and set with precious stones, and a longer chain that hung lower on the chest. The bajuband, or armlet, was worn on the upper arm, made of gold and silver, and occasionally studded with precious stones. Bracelets adorned the wrists, while anklets jingled with every step. For a prince like Ashoka or Susima, appearing at court or before the army, the weight of gold and gems upon their person would have been substantial, a literal burden of wealth that proclaimed their fitness to rule. The military dress of the Mauryan period showed an interesting mixture of indigenous and foreign influences, reflecting the empire's contacts with Persia and the Greek world. A sleeved tunic with cross straps across the chest to carry the quiver, combined with a leather belt for the sword, represented one style of military attire. However, the lower garment was more often the Indian antaria rather than Persian trousers, and the headgear was usually the turban or headband rather than the pointed Persian cap. This synthesis of traditions represented one of the early phases in the evolution of Indian military costume. In the kitchens of the Mauryan palace, as Bindusara lay dying in the chambers above, the preparation of food continued according to the rhythms that had governed the royal household for generations. The chief cook, one of the officials whom the king was required to see each morning, according to the Arthashastra, oversaw a staff that prepared meals not merely for the emperor, but for the vast household of princes, queens, ministers, guards, and servants who inhabited the palace complex. Food in the Mauryan world was not simply sustenance, it was medicine, it was politics, it was religion, and it was a window into the agricultural abundance and commercial networks that sustained the empire. The staple grains of the Mauryan diet varied with the seasons, reflecting the agricultural calendar that governed life throughout the empire. The winter season brought rice and millet, which formed the major part of the Mauryan diet during the cooler months. The summer season saw wheat and barley take their place on the table. Between these two main growing seasons, a third crop included varieties of lentils and pulses that provided protein to a population that was increasingly turning toward vegetarianism under the influence of Buddhist and Jain teachings. The preparation of these grains followed methods that had been refined over millennia. Rice was boiled or steamed, sometimes flavored with spices and ghee, clarified butter that could be stored without refrigeration. Wheat was ground into flour and baked into flatbreads called chapatis, or, with the addition of yeast, into the softer naan that could be torn and used to scoop up curries and stews. The sharp scent of turmeric and cumin roasting in ghee, the sweetness of sugarcane juice cooling in clay vessels, the earthy aroma of rice steaming in copper pots. These were the sensory markers of Mauryan cuisine. Dairy products formed a crucial part of the Mauryan diet, and the Arthashastra devotes considerable attention to the management of cattle and the production of milk, butter, and ghee. Besides cow's milk, the milk of buffaloes, sheep, and goats was also used. The morning ritual prescribed for the king included saluting a cow with its calf and a bull, acknowledging the sacred status of cattle in Indian culture and their practical importance to the economy. Meat was not absent from the Mauryan table, despite the growing influence of vegetarian religious movements. The Arthashastra lays down specific regulations for the superintendent of slaughterhouses, indicating that meat consumption was regulated and taxed by the state. Fresh fish from the rivers that surrounded Pataliputra supplemented the diet, as did game from the forests that still covered much of the empire. However, by around 300 BCE, under the influence of Buddhism and Jainism, many Hindus were coming to feel that animal sacrifices added to one's karma, the accumulated moral consequences of one's actions, and prevented liberation from the wheel of reincarnation. Spices were the glory of Indian cooking, and the Mauryan period saw the use of a sophisticated palette of flavors that would later make Indian cuisine famous throughout the world. Cinnamon, cumin, coriander, anise, and fennel. These Central Asian herbs and spices had been incorporated into Indian cooking since the Harappan era. Turmeric, with its golden color and earthy flavor, was used both in cooking and in religious rituals. Black pepper, native to the Malabar coast of southern India, was already a valuable trade commodity. The concept of Ayurveda, a system of traditional medicine whose name means knowledge of life, profoundly influenced Mauryan food culture. According to Ayurvedic principles, food was seen as a means to maintain balance and harmony within the body, and diets were planned according to each person's body type and constitution. The concept of sattvic food, pure, clean, and nourishing, emphasized fresh vegetables, fruits, grains, and dairy products prepared with minimal processing. The king's physician, whom he was required to see each morning, would have advised on diet as part of the overall management of royal health. The Mauryan food scientists made significant contributions to agriculture and horticulture. They are credited with developing improved varieties of sorghum that was easier to harvest and that quickly spread from India to China, West Asia, and East Africa. They also bred different kinds of citrus fruit together to create sweet oranges, expanding the fruit options available to the increasingly vegetarian population. These innovations reflected the state's investment in agricultural productivity, which was essential for feeding the vast armies and bureaucracies that maintained the empire. The succession crisis of 273 to 269 BCE would have disrupted these patterns of food production and distribution. Civil war meant soldiers marching across agricultural lands, requisitioning grain and livestock to feed the armies. It meant farmers fleeing their fields, leaving crops unharvested. It meant the breakdown of the trade networks that brought spices from the south, fish from the rivers, and exotic delicacies from foreign lands. For the common people of the empire, the struggle between Ashoka and his brothers was not merely a political drama, but a threat to their daily bread. In the palace itself, the preparation of food was surrounded by elaborate security measures. Musicians who performed before the king had to use instruments kept in the palace and free from any taint of poison, a reminder that assassination by poisoning was a constant threat. The Arthashastra devotes considerable attention to the detection and prevention of poisoning, listing the signs that food has been tampered with and the antidotes for various toxins. As Bindusara's health failed and his sons maneuvered for position, the meals served in the palace would have been occasions for political theatre. Who sat where at the royal table? Who was served first? Whose cup was filled with the finest wine? All these details communicated status and favour. The dying emperor, if he could still eat, would have been served the most delicate and easily digestible foods, prepared according to Ayurvedic principles for the sick. His sons, waiting for news of his death, would have eaten in their own chambers, perhaps too anxious to taste the food that servants placed before them. The material culture of the Mauryan Empire thus provides a lens through which to view the succession crisis, not as an abstract political struggle, but as an event that affected the daily lives of millions of people, from the emperor in his palace to the farmer in his field. The grains that filled the granaries, the spices that flavored the curries, the ghee that sizzled in the cooking pots, all these were products of an agricultural system that depended on political stability for its functioning. When that stability was threatened by civil war, the consequences rippled outward from the palace kitchens to the humblest village hearth. Chapter 5. An Empire Among Empires. The succession crisis that convulsed the Mauryan Empire in 273 BCE did not unfold in isolation, sealed off from the rest of the ancient world by the towering peaks of the Himalayas or the vast expanse of the Indian Ocean. On the contrary, the Mauryan Empire was deeply integrated into the networks of trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange that connected the civilizations of Asia, the Middle East, and the Mediterranean. To understand the stakes of Ashoka's struggle for the throne, we must understand India's position in this wider world. not as a peripheral region on the edge of the known world, but as a major power whose wealth, military strength, and cultural achievements made it a player on the global stage. The foundation of India's integration into the wider world had been laid by Ashoka's grandfather, Chandragupta Maurya, in his dealings with Seleucus I Nicator, one of Alexander the Great's generals, who had carved out an empire stretching from the Mediterranean to the borders of India. Around 305 BCE, Seleucus agreed to a peace treaty with Chandragupta. This treaty was not merely a cessation of hostilities, but a comprehensive diplomatic settlement that reshaped the political geography of Asia. The terms of the treaty reveal much about the relative power and priorities of the two empires. Chandragupta acquired territories in what is now Afghanistan and Baluchistan, extending Mauryan control to the Hindu Kush mountains and beyond. In exchange, he provided Seleucus with war elephants. Sources vary on the exact number, but it was likely in the hundreds. These elephants would prove crucial to Seleucid military power, giving them a decisive advantage in the wars among Alexander's successors. The treaty also established diplomatic relations between the two empires, with Seleucus sending an ambassador, Megasthenes, to reside at the Mauryan court in Pataliputra. Megasthenes' account of his time in India, though it survives only in fragments quoted by later Greek and Roman authors, provides invaluable evidence of how the Mauryan Empire appeared to foreign observers. He described Pataliputra as a magnificent city with wooden walls and towers surrounded by a moat. He described the Mauryan army as vast and well-organized, with infantry, cavalry, chariots, and elephants. He described the Mauryan administration as highly centralized, with a complex bureaucracy managing everything from taxation to public works. And he described Indian society as divided into hereditary groups, a system that fascinated and puzzled Greek observers who were accustomed to societies where social mobility, while limited, was at least theoretically possible. The presence of a Greek ambassador at the Mauryan court during the reign of Chandragupta and his son Bindusara meant that the Seleucid Empire, and through it the wider Hellenistic world, had detailed knowledge of Indian affairs. When Bindusara died in 273 BCE and civil war erupted among his sons, this was not merely an internal Indian matter, but an event with potential implications for the balance of power across Asia. Would the new Mauryan emperor maintain the treaty with the Seleucids? Would he be strong enough to control the northwestern provinces? Or would instability on the Indian frontier create opportunities for Seleucid expansion? These were questions that would have been discussed in the courts of Antioch and Alexandria, as well as in Pataliputra. The trade networks that connected India to the wider world were equally important. By the 3rd century BCE, Indian merchants were trading with Southeast Asia, Central Asia, the Middle East, and the Mediterranean world. Indian exports included textiles, particularly the fine cotton muslins that Greek and Roman authors marveled at, spices, precious stones, ivory, and exotic animals. Indian imports included horses from Central Asia, essential for the Mauryan cavalry, as well as gold and silver, wine, and luxury goods from the Hellenistic world. The monsoon winds that blow across the Indian Ocean, reversing directions seasonally, made it possible for ships to sail from the Red Sea ports of Egypt to the western coast of India and back again within a single year, creating a maritime trade network that complemented the overland routes through Central Asia. This trade was not merely an exchange of goods, but a conduit for ideas, technologies, and cultural practices. The Mauryan use of Greek-style coinage, with images of rulers and inscriptions in Greek script, reflects Hellenistic influence. The architectural features of Mauryan palaces, which Greek visitors compared favorably to the great palaces of Persia, may have incorporated Persian design elements. The Mauryan interest in Greek philosophy and science, evidenced by the presence of Greek physicians and scholars at the court, suggests a cosmopolitan intellectual culture that valued knowledge from diverse sources. Yet the flow of influence was not one way. Indian mathematics, astronomy, and medicine were highly developed by the Mauryan period, and these sciences would eventually spread westward, influencing Islamic and European thought. The concept of zero, developed in India, would revolutionize mathematics worldwide. Indian astronomical observations and calculations were remarkably accurate. Indian medical knowledge, codified in the Ayurvedic tradition, offered treatments and surgical techniques that were in some respects more advanced than those available in the Mediterranean world. The succession crisis of 273 to 269 BCE thus had implications that extended far beyond the borders of the Mauryan Empire. A prolonged civil war could disrupt the trade routes that connected India to the wider world, affecting merchants and consumers from the Mediterranean to Southeast Asia. It could create instability on the northwestern frontier, tempting the Seleucids or other powers to intervene. It could weaken the Mauryan military, making the empire vulnerable to external threats. The ministers who supported Ashoka's claim to the throne were not merely choosing a ruler for India. They were making a decision that would affect the entire network of states and peoples that depended on Mauryan stability and power. The resolution of the succession crisis, Ashoka's victory and his consolidation of power, ensured that the Mauryan Empire would continue to play its role as a major power in the ancient world. The diplomatic relations with the Hellenistic kingdoms would continue, with embassies exchanged and treaties maintained. The trade networks would continue to function, bringing wealth to Indian merchants and exotic goods to foreign markets. And the cultural exchange would continue, with Indian ideas spreading westward and foreign influences being absorbed and transformed within the Indian context. Yet Ashoka's later turn toward Buddhism and Dharma would add a new dimension to India's engagement with the wider world. The rock edicts that Ashoka erected throughout his empire, inscribed in multiple languages, including Greek and Aramaic in the northwestern provinces, were not merely domestic propaganda, but messages intended for a global audience. They proclaimed a vision of righteous rulership that transcended cultural and religious boundaries, a vision that would influence rulers and thinkers across Asia for centuries to come. The Buddhist missionaries that Ashoka sent to foreign lands, including, according to Buddhist tradition, to the Hellenistic kingdoms of the West, carried Indian religious and philosophical ideas to new audiences, planting seeds that would eventually grow into the global religion that Buddhism would become. The historian approaching Ashoka's succession war faces a fundamental challenge. The sources that preserve this story were written centuries after the events they describe, by authors with clear religious and didactic agendas. The primary sources fall into two main traditions. The North Indian tradition is preserved in Sanskrit language texts such as the Divyavadana and its constituent Ashokavadana. The Sri Lankan tradition is preserved in Pali language texts such as the Dipavamsa and Mahavamsa. There are several significant differences between the two traditions. The Sri Lankan tradition emphasizes Ashoka's role in convening the Third Buddhist Council and his dispatch of several missionaries to distant regions, including his son Mahinda, to Sri Lanka. However, the North Indian tradition makes no mention of these events. Even while narrating the common stories, the two traditions diverge in several ways. The reliability of these sources is undermined by hagiographic tendencies, as they serve to dramatize Ashoka's pre-conversion violence and subsequent moral awakening, aligning with Buddhist doctrinal goals rather than empirical reporting. Contemporary Mauryan evidence, such as Ashoka's rock and pillar edicts inscribed from his 8th regnal year, contains no mention of Susima, fraternal strife, or the alleged fratricides. Ashoka's own inscriptions are fairly detailed, but make no mention of his ancestors or his path to power. This silence is striking. Ashoka's edicts address a wide range of topics: his conversion to Buddhism, his remorse over the Kalinga War, his policies of Dharma, his welfare measures, his religious tolerance. Yet they say nothing about how he came to power, nothing about his brothers, nothing about the violence that preceded his reign. The edicts give us the after, but not the before. What can we conclude from this complex evidentiary landscape? First, that a succession war did occur. The 4-year gap between Bindusara's death and Ashoka's coronation, attested in multiple independent traditions, strongly suggests a period of conflict. Second, that Susima was Ashoka's principal rival and was killed during or shortly after the succession conflict. Third, that the scale of violence was probably more limited than the Buddhist sources suggest. Ashoka likely killed a handful of brothers rather than 99. Fourth, that the ministerial class played a crucial role in determining the succession. Finally, that Ashoka's silence about his succession in his own inscriptions may reflect not innocence but deliberate suppression, a desire to present himself as a reformed ruler without dwelling on the violence that brought him to power. Chapter 6: The Crucible and the Crown. And so, in the year 269 BCE, 4 years after his father's death, Ashoka finally performed the coronation ceremony that marked the formal beginning of his reign. The civil war was over. Susima was dead, his ashes scattered, or his bones buried in some unmarked grave. Other brothers had been killed or had submitted, accepting positions as viceroys in distant provinces or retiring from public life altogether. The ministers who had gambled on Ashoka had won their bet, and Radhagupta took his place as prime minister of the greatest empire the subcontinent had ever known. The man who emerged from those 4 years of blood and fire was not yet the Dharmashoka of later legend. That transformation would come only after the Kalinga War, some 8 years into his reign, when the horrors of conquest would finally break something within him and set him on a different path. But the succession war had shaped him in ways that made the later transformation possible. It had taught him the cost of violence, the fragility of power, the emptiness of victory purchased with the blood of brothers. The pattern of the dramatic conversion, the transformation from violence to peace, from persecution to tolerance, from worldly ambition to spiritual seeking, appears repeatedly in the world's religious and political traditions. Yet in most cases, the before is either unknown or deliberately obscured, leaving us with only the sanitized after that serves the purposes of hagiography and propaganda. Ashoka's case is different. The Buddhist sources that preserve his story, far from concealing his violent past, emphasize it, even exaggerate it, precisely because the contrast between Chandashoka and Dharmashoka is essential to the message they wish to convey. That no one is beyond redemption, that even the most violent and cruel ruler can be transformed by the teachings of the Buddha. The closest parallel in Western tradition is the story of Paul of Tarsus, the persecutor of Christians who became Christianity's greatest missionary after his conversion on the road to Damascus. Like Ashoka, Paul's authority as a teacher derived in part from his violent past. He could speak about the transformative power of faith because he had experienced it himself. Yet Paul was not a ruler, did not command armies, did not have the power to shape the lives of millions. His transformation, however dramatic, was primarily a personal and spiritual matter. A closer parallel might be found in the Roman Emperor Constantine, who in the 4th century CE would convert to Christianity and transform it from a persecuted sect into the official religion of the Roman Empire. Constantine, like Ashoka, came to power through violence, defeating his rivals in a series of civil wars. Constantine, like Ashoka, experienced a religious conversion that changed the course of his reign and the history of his empire. Yet the differences are also significant. Constantine's conversion did not lead him to renounce violence. He continued to wage wars and execute rivals throughout his reign. His embrace of Christianity was as much a political calculation as a spiritual transformation. Ashoka's transformation, as we shall see in later episodes of this series, was more thoroughgoing and more paradoxical than Constantine's. He did not merely adopt Buddhism as a state religion, while continuing to rule as emperors had always ruled. Instead, he attempted to reimagine the very nature of rulership, to exercise power in accordance with Dharma rather than mere force. He erected rock edicts throughout his empire, proclaiming his remorse for the violence of the Kalinga War and his commitment to governing through moral persuasion rather than coercion. He sent Buddhist missionaries to foreign lands, not to conquer territory, but to spread the Dharma. He established hospitals for humans and animals, planted trees along roads, dug wells for travelers, acts of public welfare that went far beyond what was expected of ancient rulers. Yet this transformation was not a simple rejection of his violent past, but a complex engagement with it. Ashoka did not abdicate the throne or renounce worldly power. He remained emperor, commanding armies and collecting taxes, exercising the coercive power of the state. The rock edicts that proclaimed his commitment to Dharma also contained warnings to forest tribes who resisted Mauryan authority, reminding them that the emperor, though remorseful, still possessed the power to punish. The man who had fought a 4-year civil war to seize the throne did not suddenly become a pacifist saint, but rather a ruler who attempted to balance the demands of power with the requirements of Dharma, a balance that was never fully achieved and that contained inherent contradictions. It is precisely these contradictions that make Ashoka's story so compelling and so relevant to our own time. We live in a world where power is still exercised through violence, where states still wage wars and suppress dissent, where the gap between our ideals and our actions remains vast. Ashoka's attempt to bridge that gap, to transform the exercise of power itself, speaks to our own struggles with these questions. His partial success and ultimate failure, for the Mauryan Empire would decline and fragment within decades of his death, remind us that the transformation of power is not a simple matter of good intentions, but requires sustained effort and often falls short of its goals. To understand this transformation, we must first understand what Ashoka was transforming from. We must understand the succession war of 273 to 269 BCE, not as an unfortunate prelude to be quickly passed over, but as an essential part of the story, the crucible in which Ashoka's character was forged. The man who emerged from that 4-year bloodbath was not the man who would later proclaim his commitment to Dharma. That transformation would come only after the Kalinga War. But the succession war shaped him in ways that made the later transformation possible. The 4-year gap between Bindusara's death in 273 BCE and Ashoka's formal coronation in 269 BCE is not merely a chronological detail, but a window into this violent period. 4 years is a long time for a succession crisis, long enough for multiple campaigns, for the siege of fortified cities, for the gradual elimination of rivals and the consolidation of control over distant provinces. The fact that Ashoka could not perform the coronation ceremony until 269 BCE suggests that his control over the empire was contested for years, that he had to fight for every province and every city, that his victory was not a foregone conclusion, but the result of sustained military and political effort. This context makes his later transformation all the more remarkable. It is one thing for a ruler who has inherited power peacefully to proclaim his commitment to non-violence and Dharma. It is quite another for a ruler who has fought his way to the throne through 4 years of civil war, who has eliminated his brothers and crushed all opposition to make such a proclamation. The latter carries a weight and an authority that the former cannot match, because it is born of lived experience rather than abstract idealism. The succession war of 273 to 269 BCE thus remains partially obscured by the mists of time and the agendas of our sources. Yet enough emerges to recognize it as a pivotal moment in Indian history, a violent struggle that brought to power a man who would, in time, renounce violence and transform the religious landscape of Asia. The blood spilled in those 4 years would, paradoxically, water the seeds of a message of peace that would spread across continents and endure for millennia. As the monsoon rains fell on Pataliputra in 269 BCE, washing the dust from the palace walls and filling the moats that surrounded the city, a new emperor sat upon the throne of the Mauryas. He was perhaps 30 years old, hardened by war and conspiracy, surrounded by ministers who had helped him seize power, and generals who had fought his battles. The empire that stretched before him, from the Hindu Kush to the Bay of Bengal, from the Himalayas to the Deccan, was the largest political entity the Indian subcontinent had ever known, and it was his to command. What thoughts passed through his mind as he contemplated his realm, we cannot know. Did he think of the brothers he had killed, the blood that had purchased his crown? Did he feel triumph or guilt, or simply the exhaustion of a man who had fought for 4 years and finally won? Did he already sense the emptiness that would later drive him to seek a different path? Or was he still intoxicated by the power he had seized? The sources do not tell us. They give us the before, the violence of the succession war, and the after, the transformation following the Kalinga War. The years between remain largely silent, a period when Ashoka ruled as emperors had always ruled, expanding his territory, consolidating his power, preparing for the war that would change everything. But that is a story for another night. For now, let us leave Ashoka on his throne, the crown heavy upon his head, the empire spread before him like a map of possibilities. The rain falls softly on the gardens of the palace, where peacocks shelter beneath the flowering trees. The oil lamps flicker in the corridors, where ministers once whispered their conspiracies. The elephants trumpet in the royal stables, and somewhere in the city, a Buddhist monk sits in meditation, unaware that his teachings will one day transform the man who now rules over all. The story of Ashoka is ultimately a story about the possibility of change. Not easy change, not simple change, but profound and difficult transformation that requires confronting one's own capacity for violence and choosing a different path. In a world that often seems locked into cycles of violence and retribution, where the powerful rarely question the exercise of power, and where ideals are easily sacrificed to expediency, Ashoka's story offers a different vision. The vision of a ruler who, having experienced the full horror of violence, chose to seek a different way. Whether he succeeded or failed, whether his transformation was complete or partial, whether his legacy endured or faded, these are questions for later episodes. For now, it is enough to understand that the transformation began with the succession war, that the after cannot be understood without the before, and that the violence of 273 to 269 BCE was not merely a regrettable prelude, but an essential part of one of history's most remarkable stories. And so we leave the ancient world of the Mauryas, with its wooden palaces and war elephants, its fine muslins and spiced curries, its prophecies and conspiracies. The rain continues to fall on Pataliputra, as it has fallen for millennia, nourishing the rice paddies that feed the empire and filling the rivers that carry its trade. The stars wheel overhead, the same stars that the Ajivika astrologer studied when he prophesied Ashoka's destiny. And somewhere in the palace, a young emperor sleeps, dreaming perhaps of the brothers he has lost, or of the empire he has won, or of a future he cannot yet imagine. A future in which he will try to become something more than a conqueror, something more than a king. May your own dreams be peaceful, and may you wake refreshed to face whatever challenges tomorrow brings. Until next time, this has been Nidra Narratives, and we thank you for joining us on this journey into the ancient past. Good night.